The wolf was gone before the dogs reached it. That was the thing the hunters could not explain afterward. The detail that turned a successful pursuit into something none of them would speak about easily. Something they would recount in low voices for the rest of their lives. They had cornered it in the fields outside Bedburg on a grey October afternoon in 1589. The animal had been running hard, moving through harvested farmland with the particular urgency of a creature that understands it is being driven, that the circle is closing, that the open ground ahead is running out. The dogs were baying. The men were shouting. The trap was working exactly as it was supposed to work. And then the wolf simply ceased to be, not with any sound, not with any flash of light or sulphurous smell, nothing that a man might later claim as evidence of the diabolical, nothing theatrical. One moment there was an animal, large, dark-coated, moving fast through the autumn stubble of the fields. The next moment there was a man standing in that same place, in that same field, wearing ordinary clothes, looking for all the world as if he had simply stepped outside his door that morning and gone walking. The hunters knew him. That was the part that did not get easier with time. This was not a stranger revealed beneath the wolf's skin, not an unknown face staring back at them from the cold field, not a monster wearing a human mask that no one had ever seen before. This was Peter Stubber, a farmer, a man who had lived in the Bedburg region for as long as most of them could remember, a man who had neighbors, and a daughter, and a reputation as someone unremarkable in the way that most people are unremarkable, a man whose name you might speak in a sentence about the harvest, or the condition of the road, or the price of grain. Not a name you would speak with horror, not a name you would say in the dark, and feel your throat tighten. They arrested him without resistance. That was the other thing people noted afterward. He did not run. He did not struggle, or call out or attempt to use the same strength against them that the wolf had demonstrated in the fields. He stood in the October cold and let them take him, and his expression, by the accounts that survived, was not the expression of a man caught in a terrible moment. It was the expression of a man who had perhaps been waiting in some deep and exhausted part of himself to be found. The village of Bedburg and the electorate of Cologne had been living under a particular kind of fear for the better part of 25 years. Children had gone missing from the roads and the edges of fields. Adults had been found dead, their bodies mutilated in ways that the community told itself were consistent with animal attack. Because the alternative, the thing that lay on the other side of that explanation, was something the mind resisted. Livestock had been killed in numbers that exceeded what ordinary wolves would take, and over all of it, over the years of loss and grief and the slow, grinding accumulation of dread, there had been the sense of something intelligent at work, something that knew the land, something that understood how people moved through it, when they would be alone, when the roads would be empty, when a child might be walking a familiar path between two places that should have been safe. Wolves did not plan. Wolves did not choose. Whatever was killing the people of Bedburg had been doing both, and now it had a face, and the face belonged to a man they knew. In the weeks and months that followed that October afternoon, the full shape of what Peter Stubber had done would emerge from interrogation sessions that no one in the modern world would accept as legitimate, set down in confessions extracted by methods that guaranteed a certain kind of answer, regardless of the underlying truth. The confession that survives, reproduced in a pamphlet printed in London in 1590, describes a man who had made a compact with the devil as a young boy, who had been given a magical belt that allowed him to transform at will, who had killed and consumed over a period that spanned the better part of a generation. The details are specific and terrible, and impossible to verify, and impossible to entirely dismiss, because behind the demonological framework, behind the theological scaffolding that the period required in order to make sense of extraordinary evil, there is something real, something that did happen, something that the fields and forests around Bedburg witnessed and that the community buried and mourned. The story of Peter Stubbe is not a story about werewolves. It is a story about what human beings are capable of, and about how a community constructs the language it needs to describe the inconceivable. It is a story about 25 years of fear, and how that fear ended on a wheel outside a German town on the last day of October, 1589, with a crowd gathered to watch, and a severed head placed on a pole, as proof that the authorities had, at last, done what they were supposed to do. But it is also a story about the man standing in the field, the familiar face, the neighbour, the monster who had always had a name, who had eaten at tables and walked known roads and looked people in the eye for decades, while something vast and terrible lived behind that ordinary gaze. The wolf was gone before the dogs reached it, and in its place stood a man. That is where this story begins. To understand what Peter Stubbe did, and why the community around him responded the way it did, and why his case became something that echoed across Europe and down through centuries, you have to first understand the world he lived in, not as a backdrop, not as local colour, but as the actual substance of his story. Because the horror of what happened in Bedburg was not separate from its time and place. It grew directly out of both. Bedburg sits in the lower Rhineland, in what is today the western part of Germany, not far from Cologne. In the middle decades of the 16th century, it was a small agricultural settlement, the kind of community that existed in its thousands across the Holy Roman Empire, defined by farming, by seasonal rhythms, by the particular geography of flat land, crossed by rivers and edged by forest. The Rhine ran nearby, broad and significant, a trade artery that connected the region to larger centres of commerce and governance. But Bedburg itself was not a significant place. It was a place where people were born and worked and died, where everyone knew the names of everyone else's children, where the boundaries of a person's world were drawn by what could be reached on foot or by cart. The landscape mattered enormously to daily life in ways that are difficult to fully recover now. The farmland around Bedburg was productive but exposed, open fields stretching between settlements, with patches of woodland at the edges, where the land became less useful for cultivation. These woodlands were not wild in the modern romantic sense. They were managed, harvested for timber and fuel, used for pig herding and foraging. But they were also genuinely dangerous in ways that modern forest walks are not. Wolves were real. Not metaphorical wolves, not figures of speech, but actual animals that came out of the woodland margins at night and took livestock, that occasionally attacked people who were isolated or vulnerable, that represented a constant and practical threat to the livelihoods of farming families, who could not afford to lose animals to predation. The fear of wolves in 16th century rural Germany was not superstition. It was rational. It was grounded in genuine experience, in lost sheep and torn open livestock pens, and the occasional terrible case of a child or elderly person found dead at a forest edge. This existing, legitimate fear of wolves is essential context for everything that followed. When children began disappearing from the roads around Bedburg, and adults began turning up dead in conditions consistent with animal attack, the community's first explanation, that a large and unusually predatory wolf was responsible, was not foolish. It was the reasonable application of existing knowledge to new events. The mind reaches first for the familiar explanation, and in a community where wolves had always been a genuine threat, a wolf was the familiar explanation. But Bedburg, in the 1560s and beyond, was not only contending with the ordinary anxieties of rural life. The region was living through a period of profound and destabilizing political and religious upheaval. The Holy Roman Empire in the second half of the 16th century was not a stable or unified entity. It was a patchwork of principalities, ecclesiastical territories and free cities, each with its own governance, its own religious alignment, and its own particular experience of the Reformation's consequences. The Rhineland sat at the centre of many of these tensions. The electorate of Cologne, within which Bedburg lay, was an ecclesiastical state. Its ruler was an archbishop, one of the 7 electors who chose the Holy Roman Emperor. In 1583, just 6 years before Stubb's capture, the sitting Archbishop of Cologne, Gebhard Truchsess von Waldburg, converted to Lutheranism and attempted to take the territory with him, transforming it from a Catholic electorate to a Protestant one. What followed was the Cologne War, a conflict that lasted until 1588 and brought military violence, displacement, and bitter confessional hatred into a region that was already stretched by decades of religious friction. Catholic forces ultimately prevailed, restoring the archdiocese to Rome and expelling the Protestant faction. But the damage to the social fabric of the region was deep and lasting. Communities that had known each other for generations found themselves divided by allegiance. Trust was corroded. The assumption that a neighbor shared your fundamental understanding of the world, your cosmology, your ethics, your account of what was real and what was dangerous, could no longer be taken for granted. And into this atmosphere of suspicion and fractured community, the theology of diabolical conspiracy found exceptionally fertile ground. The Catholic Church and the various Protestant confessions disagreed on a great deal during this period, but they shared an absolute conviction that the devil was real, that he acted in the world through human agents, and that those agents, witches, sorcerers, people who had made explicit compacts with diabolical power, were present in communities everywhere and required identification and destruction. The witch trials that spread across Europe in this period were not the product of ignorance in any simple sense. They were the product of a specific and widely shared intellectual framework, one that was held by educated jurists and theologians as firmly as it was held by illiterate farmers. The devil made pacts. He gave his servants power in exchange for their souls and their service. Those servants did harm in the world, to crops, to livestock, to children, to the social order itself. Werewolves fit within this framework without difficulty. A werewolf was not understood in 16th century Germany as a creature of purely natural origin, the way a bear or a wolf was natural. A werewolf was a person who had made a diabolical pact, who had received from the devil the power of transformation, who used that power to commit acts of predatory violence that served the devil's purposes, sowing terror, destroying innocence, undermining the bonds of community. The transformation itself was the outward sign of an inward corruption, the physical expression of a soul that had surrendered itself to evil. This theological framework had significant legal consequences. Werewolves were not tried as animals. They were tried as people who had committed 2 distinct categories of crime: the spiritual crime of diabolical compact, which was a form of heresy, and the physical crimes of murder, assault, and harm to persons and property, which were offences under secular law. The Holy Roman Empire's criminal code, the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina of 1532, provided a systematic legal framework for prosecuting both categories. It specified procedures for interrogation, including the use of judicial torture to extract confessions, and it prescribed punishments calibrated to the gravity of the offence. For crimes as serious as those attributed to a werewolf, the punishments were extreme. Into this world, this specific intersection of rural fear, religious upheaval, diabolical theology, and codified legal violence, Peter Stubbe had been living for decades without detection. What we know of him directly is limited and filtered through hostile sources. He was a farmer of some standing in the Bedburg region, not wealthy but not destitute, a man with property and a local reputation. He had a daughter whose name is recorded as Biel in the primary German sources, though some later accounts render it as Sibyl. He had at some point a son. His wife appears to have died before the events of 1589, making him a widower, managing a household and a farm. He was, in other words, a recognizable figure, the kind of person every village had several of, whose presence at a market or a church service would not merit comment. And yet, something had been happening in the fields and on the roads around Bedburg for what the confession would later claim was 25 years. The killings attributed to the creature the community had been hunting did not begin suddenly. They accumulated. A disappearance here, a death there, intervals long enough that each incident might be absorbed as isolated tragedy before the next one occurred. Children were the most common victims, the most vulnerable, the least able to defend themselves, the ones most likely to be moving alone on familiar paths that had always been safe before. But adults died too, and pregnant women, and livestock in numbers that strained credibility as ordinary wolf predation. The community responded as communities in this situation always did, with increasing vigilance, with organized hunts, with the erection of the theological and social structures necessary to contain the fear. Parents kept children closer to home. Travelers moved in groups when they could. Priests offered prayers for protection. The authorities, such as they were at the local level, attempted hunts that flushed animals from the woodland margins without producing any satisfying conclusion. Because the animal they were hunting did not live in the woodland margins. It lived among them. It knew their names and their children's names, and the hours when the roads would be empty, and the patterns of a community observed from the inside over a lifetime. It had sat in their presence at markets and feast days, and had watched them with eyes that gave nothing away, and had gone home to whatever it was, when it was not among them, and had done what it did in the spaces they had not thought to look. The wolf they were hunting wore a farmer's face, and it had been living in Bedburg all along. The confession of Peter Stubber runs to several thousand words in the pamphlet that preserved it. It is detailed in the way that confessions extracted under judicial torture tend to be detailed, specific about names and methods and sequences of events, structured in a way that satisfies the expectations of the interrogators, shaped by the questions asked, rather than by any spontaneous outpouring of guilt. Modern historians approach it with appropriate caution, and yet it is also the closest thing to a direct account of what happened in the fields and on the roads around Bedburg across a quarter-century of killing, and to discard it entirely is to lose the only sustained narrative that survives of what Peter Stubber did, or what was done in his name, or what the community of Bedburg believed had been done in the years before that October afternoon when the wolf became a man. The confession begins, as these accounts often did, not with the first killing, but with the origin, the diabolical compact that explained everything else. According to what was recorded, Stubb claimed that his arrangement with the devil had begun when he was approximately 12 years old, a child still, young enough that the seduction had the particular quality that dark theology always attributed to diabolical recruitment. The targeting of innocence, the corruption of the unformed, the planting of evil in soil that had not yet fully hardened against it. The devil appeared to him in the account and offered him whatever his heart desired: power, pleasure, the satisfaction of appetites that ordinary human life could not contain. Stubber accepted, and the devil, in confirmation of the pact, gave him a belt. The belt, sometimes rendered in translations as a girdle, was the mechanism of transformation. It was made of wolf skin, according to the confession, and when Stubber buckled it around his body, he was transformed into the likeness of a wolf. Not a natural wolf, the account was careful to specify, but something greater and more terrible, a creature of extraordinary size and strength, with eyes that burned in the darkness like coals, with jaws capable of crushing bone, with the endurance and cunning of something that was not entirely animal and not entirely human, but partook of the worst qualities of both. When he removed the belt, he returned to human form, in standing again in his own clothes, indistinguishable from any other man walking the roads of the Rhineland. The belt was never recovered. When investigators searched the field where Stubbe claimed to have discarded it, they found nothing. The pamphlet account interprets this absence as further evidence of diabolical involvement. The devil reclaiming his instrument when it was no longer needed, refusing to leave physical evidence that might limit the terror the story could generate. Whether one accepts that interpretation or prefers the simpler explanation that no belt existed because the transformation never occurred, the result is the same. There is no artifact. There is only the confession and the crimes it describes. And the crimes it describes are extraordinary in their scale, their duration, and their particular brutality. The confession places the beginning of the killing approximately in 1564, when Stubbe would have been a young man, the diabolical compact already established for some years. The first victims, as recorded, were people encountered on the roads and in the fields outside Bedburg, isolated travellers, individuals who had the misfortune to be alone in places where the wolf could operate without witnesses. The killings in this early period were presented as episodic rather than systematic, the expression of an appetite that required feeding but had not yet developed the confidence or the methodology of the later years. But the appetite grew as years passed and no predator was identified. As the community's fear remained focused on the idea of an animal rather than a person, the attacks became more frequent and more targeted. Children began to disappear with a regularity that the community absorbed as terrible but inexplicable, attributing each death to the wolf they believed was haunting the region's margins. The confession would later account for 13 children killed over the course of the 25-year period, a number that, spread across a quarter century in a small agricultural community, would not necessarily have announced itself as the work of a single perpetrator. Deaths and disappearances in this period, in this kind of community, were not uncommon. Childhood was genuinely dangerous. Disease took children routinely. Accidents on farms and roads were frequent. Each death attributed to the wolf might have been absorbed as one more tragedy in a landscape already accustomed to loss. The specific victims documented in the pamphlet account carry names and circumstances that give them individual weight, that prevent them from collapsing into mere statistics of horror. Among those recorded were children taken from paths they had walked dozens of times before, paths between farms or between village and field that should have been safe, children who had perhaps been told to hurry home before dark, who had been given the ordinary warnings that parents gave, who had done nothing wrong except walk a familiar road at the wrong moment. The confession describes the manner of their deaths with a specificity that is either the product of genuine recollection or of interrogators who had studied the recovered bodies closely enough to know the details they needed to hear confirmed. Either way, the specificity is terrible. Among the most disturbing single acts recorded in the confession, and there is genuine competition for that distinction across a document of sustained horror, is what Stubbe claimed to have done to his own son, a child, his own child, born of his own blood, raised in the same household, known to him in the complete and irreducible way that a parent knows a child. The confession states that Stubbe killed this boy, and that he consumed part of his brain. The pamphlet records this detail with the particular horror that contemporaries reserve for acts that violated not only the laws of God and man, but the most fundamental structures of human nature itself. The killing of one's own child was not merely murder. It was the annihilation of the most basic bond that existed. The final proof that whatever had once been human in Peter Stuber had been entirely consumed by what he had become. This act, more than any other in the confession, signals the degree to which the diabolical framework was being applied to explain something that exceeded ordinary criminal violence. A man who killed strangers was a murderer. A man who killed his own child and consumed him was something else. A figure whose crimes required a different vocabulary, a different set of categories. The theology of diabolical compact provided that vocabulary. He had given his soul away. He had surrendered his humanity at the moment of the original pact. Everything that followed, the killing of his child included, was the expression of that surrender, the living out of what he had agreed to become. 2 pregnant women were also counted among his victims in the confession. Their deaths were described with particular emphasis in the pamphlet account, because the killing of pregnant women and the consumption, as the confession alleged, of the unborn children carried specific theological resonance in a period when the destruction of potential life was understood as an act with diabolical dimensions. The unborn were innocent in a way that admitted no qualification. Their destruction was not just murder, but something that reached toward the sacrilegious, the attack on life at its most defenseless and its most sacred. The women in Peter Stuber's life occupied a different, but no less disturbing place in the confession. Beale, his daughter, is identified in the primary sources as having been maintained in an incestuous relationship with her father across a significant period of time. She was tried alongside him, convicted as complicit in his crimes, and executed on the same day. The nature and extent of her involvement, whether she was a knowing participant, a victim of her father's violence and authority, someone who had been so thoroughly controlled by Stuber that the distinction between complicity and coercion became difficult to establish, was not a question the trial was designed to answer. The legal framework required accomplices, and Beale filled that role. What her actual experience of her father's crimes had been, what she knew and when she knew it, and how much she had chosen and how much had been done to her, is something the historical record cannot recover. Catherine Trompin, identified as Stubb's mistress, was also tried and executed. She too was presented in the confession and the pamphlet as complicit, as someone who had participated in, or at minimum, known about crimes of extraordinary severity. The pattern of implicating the women closest to an accused man was common in this period's judicial proceedings. The diabolical network was presumed to extend outward from the central figure, and those in intimate proximity to him were presumed contaminated by that proximity. Whether Catherine Trompin had any genuine knowledge of what Stuber had been doing across those 25 years, or whether she was simply the woman who had been his companion and therefore could not be allowed to survive the proceedings against him, is another question the record refuses to answer cleanly. What the record does allow, even after all appropriate skepticism about confession under torture and the theological scaffolding imposed on the events, is the recognition of a pattern that is consistent with what modern criminology would identify as serial predatory violence conducted over an extended period by someone with deep knowledge of the community and the landscape, the targeting of the vulnerable, children, isolated women, pregnant women, the use of environmental knowledge to locate victims when they were alone, the long intervals between some incidents that prevented the accumulation of evidence pointing to a single perpetrator, the way the animal explanation functioned as cover, directing the community's fear and its investigative energy toward the woodland margins and away from the household, and the face they already knew. Whether or not Peter Stuber believed himself to be a werewolf, whether the diabolical compact was his own framework for understanding what he was, a story he told himself in the privacy of whatever passed for his inner life, or whether it was a framework imposed entirely by his interrogators, is ultimately unknowable. What is knowable, or as close to knowable as the evidence allows, is that something with intelligence and local knowledge and patience had been killing people around Bedburg for 25 years, and that when the name was finally attached to the crimes, it was a name the community had always known. The belt that the devil gave him was never found, but the bodies were real, and so were the graves. The hunting party that went out in October of 1589 was not the first organized effort to find and kill the creature that had been haunting the roads and fields around Bedburg. There had been hunts before, coordinated drives through the woodland margins, men with dogs moving in lines through undergrowth, traps set at the edges of the forest where animal paths crossed cultivated land. All the methods that a rural community applied when a predator became too costly to tolerate. None of them had produced a satisfactory conclusion. The wolf, whatever it was, had proven impossible to corner, impossible to track to a den or lair, impossible to kill or even to wound in any way that left evidence of a hit. It moved through the landscape, as if it knew the hunter's patterns, as if it anticipated their methods, as if it understood not just the terrain but the minds of the people searching for it, which of course it did, because it was one of them. What brought matters to a head in the autumn of 1589 is not entirely clear from the surviving sources. The pamphlet account does not explain why this particular hunt, in this particular season, succeeded where previous efforts had failed over the course of many years. It is possible that the authorities had by this point begun to suspect that the predator was not purely an animal, that the pattern of killings, the specific targeting of victims, the apparent intelligence of the creature's evasions had led someone in a position of authority to consider the possibility of a human agent operating behind or alongside the wolf attacks. A natural wolf, however large and aggressive, does not select victims with the discriminating attention that the Bedburg deaths demonstrated. A natural wolf does not take a child from the edge of a group while leaving the others unharmed, does not avoid leaving tracks on soft ground, does not confine its attacks to moments of perfect isolation, as if it had been watching its intended victim long enough to know when they would be alone. It is also possible that Peter Stubbe had made an error, that after 25 years of operating with apparent impunity, something had slipped, a sighting at the wrong moment, a connection made between his movements and a death that could not be explained away, a witness who had seen something and held it privately for months or years before finally speaking. The slow erosion of a secret that has been kept too long tends to accelerate near its end. The same confidence that allows a predator to sustain concealment across decades can also produce a carelessness, a reduced vigilance born of the long habit of safety that eventually creates the opening through which discovery enters. What the sources do record is the hunt itself and its extraordinary conclusion. The men went out with dogs, hunting dogs trained for large game, animals capable of tracking and cornering prey that a human pursuer alone could not run down in open country. The wolf was found, was flushed from whatever cover it had been using, and was driven across the open farmland outside Bedburg with the full force of the hunting party behind it. It ran as wolves run, fast and low, and with the particular desperation of an animal that has been pushed from familiar territory into ground that offers no concealment. The dogs closed the distance. The men followed on foot and perhaps on horseback, each element of the party moving to cut off the routes of escape, to compress the space available to the fleeing animal until there was nowhere left to run. And then, in the moment before the dogs reached it, the wolf was gone. In its place stood Peter Stubbe, dressed in his ordinary clothes, standing in the harvested field as if he had simply been walking there that afternoon, as if the pursuit had been a misunderstanding that a few calm words might resolve. The men who witnessed this knew him Not as a stranger, not as a figure from outside the community, but as a neighbour, a man whose face they had seen at market and in church, whose land they had passed on familiar roads, whose name they might have spoken that same morning in an entirely ordinary context. The shock of recognition was, by all accounts, profound and lasting. They had been hunting a monster. They had found a man. And the fact that the man was someone they knew did not make the discovery less horrifying. It made it considerably more so. He was taken without significant resistance. Whatever strength or ferocity the wolf had demonstrated in the fields, Peter Stubber in his human form offered nothing against the men closing in around him. No attempt to flee, no violence, no invocation of whatever power the confession would later attribute to his diabolical patron. He stood in the October cold and let them arrest him, and his expression, in what the accounts preserve of that moment, was not the expression of a man caught in an unexpected catastrophe. It carried something closer to exhaustion, the quality of a man who had been carrying something enormous for a very long time and had, in this moment, finally set it down. He was transported to the custody of the local authorities. The precise administrative structure of the jurisdiction is somewhat unclear in the sources, but the relevant lord held the power of high justice, the authority to try and execute for capital crimes within his territory. This was the normal arrangement in the territorial patchwork of the Holy Roman Empire, where the right to conduct criminal prosecution was a privilege attached to lordship, rather than a centralized state function. The community that had lived in fear of the wolf now had its perpetrator in custody, and the machinery of imperial criminal justice began to move. The legal framework governing the proceedings was the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina, the criminal code issued under Emperor Charles V in 1532, which had standardized criminal procedure across the imperial territories and remained the governing document of criminal law throughout the Holy Roman Empire for more than 2 centuries. The Carolina was, in several respects, a relatively sophisticated legal instrument for its time. It attempted to limit arbitrary punishment, to establish consistent evidentiary standards, to ensure that conviction required something more than accusation. It required that torture be applied only when there was already substantial evidence pointing to guilt. It was not supposed to be used as a primary investigative tool on mere suspicion, but as a method of obtaining the formal confession that imperial law required for conviction in capital cases when direct evidence was otherwise incomplete. In Peter Stubber's case, the threshold for the application of torture was clearly met under the Carolina's own standards. The witness transformation constituted extraordinary evidence of extraordinary crime, whatever its actual nature. The years of deaths and disappearances that the community attributed to the wolf provided a documented pattern of harm. The specific manner of his capture, the wolf becoming a man in front of multiple witnesses, satisfied the requirement of substantial preliminary evidence. The torture that followed was legally sanctioned, procedurally regular, and entirely expected. It was also, by any measure available to a modern understanding, devastating. The primary method of judicial torture used in imperial courts of this period was the strappado, an instrument of interrogation that was efficient and repeatable in ways that made it standard across numerous jurisdictions. The prisoners' hands were bound together behind their back. A rope attached to the bound wrists was passed over a beam or pulley above. The prisoner was then hoisted into the air by the rope, their entire body weight suspended from the reversed arms, and held there, or repeatedly raised and dropped in a manner calculated to dislocate both shoulders simultaneously. The pain was immediate and extreme, the damage was reliable, and the technique could be repeated across multiple sessions, with variations in height and duration, calibrated to the degree of resistance the prisoner offered. Other methods supplemented the strappado in cases where the first application did not produce adequate confession. The sources do not specify in detail what was applied to Stubb across however many sessions were required to produce the comprehensive account that the pamphlet preserves. But the confession that emerged was thorough. It covered the full span of the alleged crimes, named victims, described methods, accounted for specific incidents in enough detail to satisfy the expectations of those conducting the interrogation. Whatever Peter Stubber experienced in the course of those sessions, the result was a document that gave the prosecution everything it needed. The confession described the diabolical compact entered into at approximately 12 years of age. It described the belt, its properties, the transformation it enabled. It described the first killings, their escalation over the years, the specific victims whose deaths and disappearances the community had been grieving across a generation. It described the killing of his son with a directness that the pamphlet account preserves almost without commentary, as if the horror of the act rendered additional language unnecessary. It described the 2 pregnant women. It described the incestuous relationship with his daughter Beale. It named Catherine Trompin as his mistress and as knowing participant in his crimes. It was, in the formal terms of imperial criminal procedure, a complete confession, the foundation on which conviction and sentencing could proceed without legal challenge. Beale was interrogated separately. The sources do not dwell on the details of what she said or what was done to induce her to say it. She was young. The exact age recorded in different accounts varies, but she was almost certainly still a young woman, rather than a mature adult, which makes the question of what she knew and what was done to her in the course of her father's crimes, and then again in the course of the legal proceedings against her, a question that the historical record refuses to answer with any clarity. She was convicted of complicity. She was sentenced to death. The machinery of justice applied to her with the same procedural regularity it applied to everyone the trial consumed. Catherine Trompin's position in the proceedings was similarly constructed by the requirements of the diabolical framework, rather than by evidence of specific criminal acts on her part. She was the mistress, the intimate companion, and therefore presumed to be within the circle of knowledge and complicity. The Carolina's provisions for accessory guilt were broad enough to encompass her. She too was convicted. She too was sentenced. 3 people were to die for what had happened in the fields and on the roads outside Bedburg, and the date was set for October 31st, 1589. The choice of that date, the eve of All Saints' Day, the threshold between the month of ordinary time and the month dedicated to the holy dead, the night the popular tradition across much of Catholic Europe associated with the thinning of the boundary between the living world and whatever lay beyond it, may have been deliberate. The symbolic resonance of executing a diabolical criminal on the night when diabolical forces were understood to be at their most active was not something that the period's sensibility would have missed or ignored. Whether the date was chosen for this reason, or simply because the preparations were complete by then, it was noted by everyone who witnessed or later read about what happened, and it became woven into the story in a way that subsequent retellings always preserved. The execution of Peter Stubber was a public event in the fullest sense of that phrase. The community gathered, Bedburg's own population and people drawn from surrounding settlements by the magnitude of the case and the accumulated weight of the fear that was finally being formally closed. Public executions in the Holy Roman Empire served explicit social functions. They were the moment at which the authority of the Lord and the law was made visible and physical, the moment at which the abstract claim of justice became concrete action. Attendance was participation in a collective ritual of restoration. The community that had been violated asserting, through its assembled presence, that the violation had been identified and would be answered. Stube was placed on a wheel, a large wagon wheel mounted horizontally on a post or frame, elevated enough that the crowd could see what was being done. The execution proceeded in stages that the pamphlet documents with careful attention. His flesh was torn from his living body in 10 places, using pincers that had been heated until they glowed red. Applied to his chest, his back, his arms, his legs, each application tearing away not just skin, but the tissue beneath, the heat of the instruments cauterizing as they destroyed. 10 wounds. The number had the quality of deliberateness, of a count, rather than an approximation, suggesting that the stages of the punishment had been planned and apportioned in advance. His limbs were then broken, not with the blade of the executioner's axe, but with its blunt reverse, a distinction that carried specific meaning in the context of executing a werewolf. To break the bones of the executed body was to ensure that the condemned could not reassemble and rise, could not return in any form to continue what had been done. The superstition was precise and deeply held. The community was not simply killing a man, it was destroying, with methodical thoroughness, whatever had animated him, making certain that nothing capable of continuation survived the proceedings. Both arms were broken, both legs were broken. The wheel held what remained. His head was then struck from his body. This was the moment of death, the killing blow after the prolonged ordeal of the preceding stages, the point at which the legal and ritual requirements of the execution were satisfied in the most fundamental sense. He had been punished. He had been destroyed. Whatever he had been, it was over. The bodies of Biel and Catherine Trompin were dealt with in the sequence that the period's conventions prescribed for female condemned. They were strangled first, a method considered more merciful than the wheel, a concession to gender that coexisted without apparent contradiction alongside their execution for crimes of the most serious kind. Once strangled, their bodies were carried to the fire that had been built for the purpose, and Stube's headless body was brought to join them. All 3 were burned together, the fire consuming what the wheel and the axe had left, reducing the physical substance of Peter Stubbe and the women convicted alongside him to ash and bone fragment in the October air outside Bedburg. The head was not burned. It was mounted on a pole, elevated above the roadside at the edge of the village, and placed there as a monument and a warning and a proof. Beside or near it, accounts vary slightly on the precise arrangement, was fixed the representation of a wolf, a carved or constructed figure of the animal whose form Stube had allegedly taken. The 2 images together formed a composite declaration. This is what it was. This is what we did about it. This is the evidence that the authorities of this community were equal to the threat. The pole stood for years. Travelers noted it. It appeared in accounts and letters from people passing through the region for a considerable time after the execution, a fixed landmark of a particular and terrible kind. The crowd that had gathered to witness dispersed back to their homes and their farms carrying what they had seen. Whether the spectacle gave them resolution, whether the formal, the theatrical destruction of Peter Stube and the monument erected from his remains closed the wound that 25 years of fear had opened in the community, is something the sources cannot confirm. The practical fear had been addressed. The wolf was gone. The children who would be born after October 31st, 1589, would grow up in a Bedburg that no longer had a creature haunting its roads and fields. In that limited, specific sense, the execution had accomplished what it was designed to accomplish. But there is a particular quality to the discovery that a monster was a neighbor, a quality that does not dissolve when the monster is destroyed. It leaves a residue, a permanent alteration in the way the community sees itself, a knowledge that cannot be unknowed. They had lived alongside Peter Stubbe for 25 years. They had known his name and his face and the location of his farm. They had perhaps spoken with him on the morning of days when he killed. They had mourned children whose deaths he had caused, while standing among the mourners, and had felt the collective grief of a community that believed it was suffering together, not understanding that one of the sufferers was the cause. That knowledge, the specific, irreversible knowledge of what had been living among them, was not addressed by the wheel or the fire or the pole at the village edge. It settled into the community and stayed there, reshaping in subtle ways how neighbors looked at one another, how trust was extended or withheld, how the familiar face was weighed against the possibility of what it might conceal. It became part of the inheritance that Bedburg passed forward. One of those things a community knows about itself, that it cannot quite articulate and cannot set aside. The execution was the end of Peter Stubbe. It was not the end of the questions his existence had raised. Those questions travelled outward from Bedburg with everyone who had witnessed the proceedings, with every letter written and every account given, with the pamphlet that would carry the story across the North Sea and into the households of another country within a year. The questions did not diminish with distance. They intensified, because the most disturbing thing about Peter Stubbe was not the wolf, it was the man. And the man was a question that no execution, however thorough, could finally answer. Within a year of the execution in the fields outside Bedburg, the story of Peter Stubbe had crossed the North Sea. A pamphlet printed in London in 1590 carried the full account to English readers, under a title that announced its contents with the directness characteristic of the period's popular press: a true discourse, declaring the damnable life and death of one Stubbe Peter, a most wicked sorcerer. It was translated from a German original that had circulated in the Rhineland in the months immediately following the execution, and it was one of several versions of the story moving through the print networks of Northern Europe simultaneously. By the time English readers were absorbing the woodcut images and the detailed confession, versions of the same account had already appeared in Dutch and French, or each translation carrying the story further from its origin point in a small agricultural community beside the Rhine, and deeper into the collective consciousness of a continent already primed to receive it. The pamphlet was a broadside in the tradition of early modern popular print. A single large sheet, or a small gathering of sheets, printed cheaply and sold for a few pennies to readers who wanted news, sensation, moral instruction, or all three simultaneously. The broadside press of the 16th century occupied a cultural position somewhat analogous to tabloid journalism in the modern world, with the significant difference that it operated without any meaningful distinction between entertainment and moral purpose. The two were understood as compatible and mutually reinforcing. A story could be horrifying and instructive at the same time. In fact, the most horrifying stories were considered the most instructive, because horror was what made warnings memorable, what drove the lesson past the surface of attention and into the deeper strata where it would remain and shape behavior. The Stubbe pamphlet was constructed along these lines with considerable skill. It opened with a summary of the diabolical compact, the 12-year-old boy, the devil's offer, the belt, that established the theological stakes immediately. This was not a crime story in the modern sense, a narrative of detection and capture that existed primarily to entertain. It was a demonological case study, a documented instance of what happened when a human soul was surrendered to diabolical agency and allowed to operate in the world without restraint. The entertainment and the warning were the same thing. You read about the killings with the same attention you would bring to any compelling narrative, and in doing so you absorb the lesson that the killings existed to teach. The form and the function were inseparable, And the people who produced these pamphlets understood that inseparability and exploited it deliberately. The woodcut illustrations that accompanied the pamphlet deserve particular attention because they did work that the text alone could not do. In a period when literacy was unevenly distributed across social classes and geographic regions, and when the cost of printed text placed it beyond some audiences entirely, images circulated independently of the words they were meant to accompany. A woodcut could be posted on a wall, passed from hand to hand, described to those who could not see it. It communicated across the barrier of illiteracy in ways that printed prose could not, carrying the essential elements of a story into communities that would never encounter the written account. The woodcuts from the Stubbe pamphlet were specific and carefully composed, and they were copied and reproduced across multiple editions and languages, appearing in contexts where the original text was absent, carrying the story's visual grammar to audiences who would never read the confession or the legal record. One depicted Stubbe in the act of transformation, a figure caught between human and animal form, the belt visible at his waist, the wolf shape emerging from or receding into the human one, depending on how you read the direction of the change. The ambiguity was not accidental. The image worked in both directions, suggesting both the donning of the wolf and the shedding of it, the deliberate assumption of the predatory form, and the equally deliberate return to human appearance. Another woodcut showed the execution itself in considerable detail, the wheel and the pincers, the crowd gathered in dense ranks to witness, the pole with its mounted head visible in the right-hand portion of the frame, the fire that consumed the bodies burning in the foreground. A third depicted individual acts of predation, the wolf attacking victims on roads and in fields, the bodies left in attitudes of violent death, the landscape of the Rhineland rendered in the flat, schematic lines of the period's woodcut style, but recognizable as the farmland and forest margins where the killings had occurred. Together these images established a visual vocabulary for the werewolf that proved extraordinarily durable. They gave the figure a specific appearance, a specific mechanism of transformation, a specific relationship to the diabolical that distinguished him from the vaguer shapeshifters of older oral tradition. Before the Stubbe pamphlet, the werewolf in Germanic and broader European folklore had been somewhat various in its visual and narrative particulars. Transformations accomplished by ointments rubbed into the skin, by enchanted wolf pelts worn whole, by curses inherited through bloodlines or imposed by enemies. The Stubbe pamphlet's belt, a device the wearer could put on and take off, that transformed and restored on demand, that had been given directly by the devil as a physical token of the diabolical compact, introduced a precision and an intentionality to the transformation narrative that proved both legally useful and culturally compelling. The werewolf who possessed a belt was a werewolf who had chosen. His transformation was an act of will, a deliberate exercise of a capability he had deliberately sought and deliberately received. He could be held fully responsible for what he did in wolf form because the wolf form itself was the expression of a choice made in human form. This was not a creature of curse or inherited affliction, whose culpability might be questioned. This was a man who had decided to become a monster, who had gone to the devil and asked for the means to do it, who had used those means with full knowledge and intent across 25 years of killing. The legal and theological clarity this provided was considerable, and the figure of the werewolf with belt became the dominant image in subsequent demonological and legal literature dealing with lycanthropy. The broader context into which the Stubbe pamphlet arrived matters enormously for understanding why it spread as rapidly and as widely as it did. The case was not an isolated anomaly, dropped into a peaceful landscape. It arrived into a Europe in which werewolf trials had been occurring with some regularity since at least the 1520s, concentrated in the territories of the Holy Roman Empire, France, and the Low Countries, and it was absorbed as a particularly vivid and comprehensively documented instance of a phenomenon that judicial and theological authorities across these territories had been treating as real and prosecutable for decades. The Stubbe case did not create the werewolf trial as a legal and cultural phenomenon. It confirmed it. It provided the most complete and widely distributed example of the phenomenon that the period had yet produced, and in doing so, it shaped all subsequent thinking about what werewolf cases were, what they looked like, what they proved. The Gondillon family in the Franche-Comté region of France were tried and executed in 1598, just 9 years after Stubbe, on charges of lycanthropy that bore significant structural resemblance to the Bedburg case. Pernette Gondillon was accused of attacking and killing 2 children while in wolf form. Her brother Pierre confessed under interrogation to making a diabolical compact and receiving a wolf skin from the devil. The entire family was convicted and executed, and the French judge Henri Bourget, who presided over the Gondillon proceedings and several comparable cases, subsequently published his systematic legal and theological treatise on witchcraft and lycanthropy, the Discours des Sorciers, in 1602. Bourget's treatise drew on the cases he had personally adjudicated as evidence for the reality of diabolical transformation, and it circulated widely among the legal and clerical authorities who would preside over subsequent proceedings. The Stubbe case was cited alongside others as part of the evidentiary foundation on which the prosecutorial framework rested. Jean Grenier, tried in France in 1603, was a teenage boy who claimed to have received a wolf skin from a figure he called the Lord of the Forest, and to have used it to attack and consume children in the region around his village. Grenier's case differed from Stubbe's in ways that the court found significant. He was young, he appeared to suffer from genuine delusions, rather than to be producing a manufactured confession, and he was ultimately sentenced to life imprisonment in a monastery rather than execution, the court finding that his mental condition diminished his culpability in ways that the law could accommodate. But the structural elements of his account mapped onto the Stubbe case with a consistency that the court noted and that subsequent commentators found significant. The diabolical figure in the forest, the transformative garment, the targeting of children, the consumption of flesh, whether this consistency reflected a shared cultural template that shaped the way disturbed individuals understood and described their own violent impulses, or whether it reflected something more troubling about the actual pattern of crimes these accounts described, was a question the period was not equipped to answer, and that subsequent centuries have not fully resolved. The French philosopher and legal theorist Jean Bodin, whose De la démonomanie des sorciers had appeared in 1580, the year that the Stubbe killing period was still ongoing, had already provided the most influential intellectual framework within which cases like Stubbe's could be understood, prosecuted, and placed within a coherent account of diabolical activity in the world. Bodin was not a marginal figure or a credulous provincial. He was one of the most significant legal and political thinkers of the 16th century, a man whose work on sovereignty and governance is still read and discussed in political philosophy, and his engagement with demonology was as serious and as systematic as his engagement with everything else. His demonological treatise argued for the reality of diabolical compact, for the genuine possibility of physical transformation, for the absolute necessity of aggressive prosecution and exemplary punishment. It was read by judges and magistrates across Europe, cited in court proceedings, entreated as authoritative by the educated classes who shaped the legal and institutional response to alleged diabolical activity. The Stubbe case arrived as a piece of empirical confirmation of what Baudin had argued theoretically. A real case that fit the theoretical framework with satisfying precision. For those who already accepted the framework, the case was evidence. For those who were uncertain, it was persuasion. The German demonological tradition had its own parallel literature. Johann Weyer, a physician who had trained under the Renaissance humanist Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, and who practiced medicine in the Duchy of Cleves, not far from the Rhineland, where Stubbe had operated, had published his De Prestigis Daemonum in 1563, a work that took the heterodox position that many of those accused of witchcraft and diabolical crime were mentally ill rather than genuinely diabolical, and that the confessions extracted under torture were products of diseased imagination rather than genuine supernatural experience. Weyer's work was controversial and was condemned by Baudin, among others, as dangerously enabling of diabolical crime, but it represents an important strand of thinking that ran alongside the mainstream prosecutorial framework. The recognition that the confessions produced by torture might describe not what had happened, but what the tortured mind, shaped by cultural expectation and the specific suggestions of interrogators, had been induced to describe. The tension between these two positions, the demonological framework that took the confessions as evidence of real diabolical activity, and the skeptical framework that saw the confessions as products of coercion and delusion, ran through the entire period of werewolf and witch persecution, and it runs through the Stubbe case specifically. The belt that was never found, the transformation witnessed by hunters in circumstances of high excitement and poor visibility on a grey October afternoon. The confession produced by judicial torture applied to a man who had strong incentives to provide exactly what his interrogators were looking for. None of these elements are straightforwardly interpretable. All of them can be read in multiple ways depending on what framework you bring to them. What the pamphlet did, with considerable effectiveness, was to suppress the ambiguity. It presented the case as settled. The diabolical compact had occurred. The transformation had been real. The crimes had been committed in wolf form. The execution had been just and necessary. Readers who encountered the pamphlet received a complete and coherent account in which all the interpretive questions had already been answered, in which the theological framework had already been applied and confirmed, in which the disturbing possibilities raised by the case had been contained within a narrative that explained everything and left nothing genuinely open. This was what pamphlet literature did. It was not journalism in the modern sense, not an attempt to present evidence and allow readers to form their own conclusions. It was persuasion, argument, in instruction, and it was extraordinarily effective at its purpose. The story it told spread across Europe and persisted across centuries, and in spreading and persisting, it carried the image of the werewolf with it, fixing that image in cultural memory, in the specific form that the Stubbe case had given it. What persisted across all the contexts into which the story spread, across the translations and the retellings and the centuries of subsequent distance, was the element that had always been the most disturbing at the core of the Stubbe case, and that no theological framework could adequately contain. Not the transformation, not the diabolical belt or the compact entered into at 12 years old, not even the specific crimes, terrible as the catalogue of them was. What persisted, what proved impossible to fully rationalize or explain away, was the simple fact of the neighbor. The man who had lived among his community for 25 years, the familiar face at the market and in the church, the person whose name required no introduction because everyone already knew it, whose presence in any gathering was unremarkable because he had always been there, whose ordinariness was the most effective disguise a predator could wear because ordinariness is what we are least equipped to look past. Every culture that received the Stubb story found in it a reflection of a fear that required no supernatural element to be devastating. The fear that the monster is not the stranger, that it is not the unknown figure at the forest's edge, or the traveller from another place whose motives are opaque because their origins are unknown. The fear that it is the person beside you, the one you have known for years, the one whose face has become so familiar that you have stopped really seeing it, stopped asking what lies behind it, stopped subjecting it to the scrutiny you would automatically apply to an unknown face. That fear required no belt, no transformation, no devil waiting in the forest to make his offer. It required only the knowledge that Peter Stubber had existed, that he had lived his double life across a generation, that the community around him had mourned the children he killed and searched for the creature he was, and never once looked at the man they already knew. The pamphlet made Peter Stubber immortal in the only way that truly endures, by making his story a story that other people told. It moved through print networks and oral tradition and theological literature, and eventually into the literary imagination of subsequent centuries, accumulating new contexts and new meanings as it travelled, without ever losing the specific, irreducible horror of its origin. A man, a community, 25 years, and no one knew. Every telling carried the same quiet and unavoidable question forward through the generations. If it happened in Bedburg, it could happen anywhere. If it was Peter Stubber, it could be anyone. The monster had always had a name that the community already knew. The question that the pamphlet left open, that it could not close no matter how completely it wrapped the story in theological explanation and judicial resolution, was the question every reader carried home with them after the last page. What name did the monster, in your own community, already have? The fields outside Bedburg are quiet now. The town still exists, a small community in the Rhineland, absorbed into the broader landscape of modern Western Germany, surrounded by the flat agricultural land that has always defined it. The roads that cross those fields are paved. The farms that border them use machinery that would have been incomprehensible to anyone alive in 1589. The woodland margins, that once pressed close to the edges of cultivation, have been pushed back further, thinned, mapped, crossed by maintained paths that walkers use on weekend afternoons. The pole where Peter Stubber's severed head once stood is long gone, the precise location where it was erected uncertain, and the monument that declared the community's victory over its monster reduced to a notation in a pamphlet that most people in Bedburg today have never read. What remains is the question, and the question, stripped of its 16th century theological clothing, is not complicated to state. It is only complicated to answer. What was Peter Stubber? The options arrange themselves with a kind of grim clarity when you set them out honestly. The first is the one the period itself insisted on. He was a man who had made a genuine diabolical compact, who had received a genuine instrument of transformation, who had genuinely become a wolf and committed his crimes in that form. This interpretation requires accepting the full cosmological framework of 16th century Catholic demonology. The devil as an active agent in the world, in physical transformation as a real possibility, the belt as a genuine artifact of supernatural power. Almost no serious historian accepts this interpretation today, and yet it is worth pausing over rather than dismissing immediately, because the people who held it were not fools. They were operating within an intellectual framework that was coherent on its own terms, that had the authority of centuries of theological elaboration behind it, and that provided a complete and satisfying account of events that otherwise defied explanation. The framework was wrong, in all likelihood, but it was not stupid. The second interpretation, is the one that modern criminology finds most tractable. Peter Stubber was a serial killer, a man with predatory appetites he could not or chose not to control, who operated within a community that trusted him, who used the landscape and the existing fear of wolf attacks as cover for violence that was entirely human in its origin and its execution. This interpretation requires no supernatural element. It requires only the acknowledgement that human beings are capable of sustained predatory violence against the most vulnerable members of their communities, that such violence can go undetected for years when the perpetrator is known and trusted, and when the investigative assumptions of the community direct attention elsewhere. Modern forensic psychology has documented enough comparable cases to make this interpretation not just plausible, but, in the view of most scholars who have examined the Stubber case, by far the most likely account of what actually happened. The third interpretation introduces an element that sits between the supernatural and the criminal. Peter Stubber may have genuinely believed himself to be a werewolf. Clinical lycanthropy, the delusional belief that one is transforming into an animal, is a documented psychiatric condition, rare but real, present in the medical literature from the ancient world onward, and described in terms that a 16th century physician would have recognized, even if the diagnostic framework differed entirely from the modern one. A man who genuinely experienced himself as transforming, whose violence was organized around a delusional system in which the wolf form was real, and the belt was real, and the devil's compact was a lived experience rather than a legal fiction. Such a man would confess to the wolf with a sincerity that manufactured confession under torture could not fully replicate. Whether the sincerity of the belief diminishes or intensifies the horror of the crimes is a question without a clean answer. The fourth interpretation is the darkest in certain respects, because it removes Peter Stubb almost entirely from the center of his own story. In a region destabilized by the Cologne War, under a legal system that required diabolical explanation for extraordinary crime, with a judicial process that produced confessions of any shape the interrogators required, it is possible that the werewolf of Bedburg was as much a construction as a discovery. That a man was identified, perhaps not entirely without reason, perhaps with very good reason, and then fitted into the available framework, his confession shaped by torture into the form that the theology and the law required it to take, that the belt and the transformation and the diabolical compact were the period's vocabulary for something it lacked other words to describe, that Peter Stubb the werewolf was partly Peter Stubber and partly the 16th century's attempt to make legible something that resisted legibility. None of these interpretations fully excludes the others. They are not clean alternatives between which a choice can be made. They overlap and intersect, each one illuminating an aspect of the case that the others leave in shadow. The serial killer and the delusional man are not mutually exclusive. The constructed confession and the genuine crime are not mutually exclusive. The theological framework that was imposed on the events does not mean the events themselves did not occur. The children of Bedburg were real. Their graves were real. Something had been moving through those fields for 25 years, and the fact that we cannot, with certainty, name what it was does not dissolve the reality of what it did. What the case of Peter Stuber ultimately demonstrates is not something about werewolves. It is something about the relationship between a community and the violence that lives within it. The wolf was a useful explanation because it placed the source of the violence outside the community, in the forest, in the margins, in the space beyond the boundary of the known and the trusted. The wolf was something that came from elsewhere. It could be hunted. It could be driven away or killed. It could be defeated by sufficient vigilance and sufficient force. The wolf was a threat that human effort could in principle address, the man was not. The man was already inside every boundary the community had erected. He had been inside them for 25 years. The walls, the prayers, the organized hunts, the warnings given to children about the dangers of the forest. None of these had any purchase on a threat that lived inside the house, that ate at the table, that wore the face of a neighbor. There was no defense against that. And the community's insistence on the wolf was partly the rational application of the most likely explanation, and partly, perhaps, the mind's resistance to a truth that was too damaging to absorb. The execution closed the case. The burning closed the body. The pamphlet closed the story into a shape that could be carried forward and made useful. But none of these closings answered the question that the case had raised, the question that travels forward through the centuries with undiminished force. How do you protect yourself from a monster that has your neighbor's face? How do you see past the familiar to the thing behind it? How do you hold simultaneously the trust that community requires to function and the vigilance that the knowledge of Peter Stubb demands? You cannot. Entirely. That is the honest answer. You cannot simultaneously live in full trust of the people around you and maintain the permanent suspicion that any of them might be something other than what they appear. One of those things makes ordinary life possible. The other makes it impossible. And the tragedy of Bedburg is that the community had to choose between them, and chose trust, and paid for that choice in the graves of children across a generation. The fields outside Bedburg are quiet now. The autumn light falls across them in the same way it has always fallen, flat and grey and without warmth, the kind of light that makes distance hard to judge and familiar shapes strange. The monster is long dead. The pole is gone. The pamphlet yellows in archives. But the question remains, and it has always been the most frightening thing about this story. Not the wolf, not the transformation, not even the crimes themselves. The most frightening thing is the 25 years before the October afternoon, when the wolf became a man. The ordinary mornings, the unremarkable face, the neighbor whose name everyone already knew. The monster was always a man, and somehow, across all the centuries that have passed since a hunting party cornered a wolf in a harvested field outside a small Rhineland town, that remains the hardest thing to hold.